All right, so we are back, and this time we're going to be looking at a poem that you might already know,
Yeah,
Climbing My Grandfather, by Andrew Waterhouse.
good one.
It's a really evocative poem,
Yes, it is.
and this deep dive is going to be useful for those of you studying GCSE English Literature and kind of going over your poetry anthology and thinking
Yeah,
about how to analyze poems. And
absolutely. And Climbing My Grandfather, it really sort of brings together this vivid and imaginative way of looking at the relationship between a child and their granddad.
yeah.
And it uses this really kind of unique and interesting concept of climbing
Yeah.
to actually explore that relationship a little bit deeper.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all relate to, right? That idea of like wanting to get to know somebody.
Yeah.
And it's almost like there's a physical journey involved.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's start with the title, Climbing My Grandfather.
Okay.
What kind of springs to mind for you when you...
Well, the first thing that you think of is just like this image of a kid,
Yeah.
full of energy and seeing their granddad almost like a landscape that they want to explore.
Yeah.
And it immediately tells you that this isn't going to be like a formal, distant kind of relationship.
Yeah.
It's something that's very active and hands-on.
Yeah. And then we get that opening line, I decided to do it free without a rope or net.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot packed into that first line.
There is. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating is just that word free.
Yeah.
It suggests, this sense of independence.
Yeah.
This is a choice that the child is making to climb their grandfather.
Yeah.
But then there's this really lovely contrast because you've got without a rope or net, which suggests that actually there's a huge amount of trust involved.
Yeah.
They feel safe enough with their granddad to kind of do this without any backup.
Yeah.
And it could also kind of hint at that kind of, childlike sense of fearlessness as well.
Yeah.
That maybe they don't always see the potential difficulties.
Yeah, like kids are always up for an adventure, right? And I think that word decide is really interesting as well,
Yeah.
because it's like it's happening right now in the present.
It is, yeah.
It's not like I climbed, it's like I decide,
Oh.
and it's all unfolding.
Yeah.
And it gives us that really kind of immediate
It does, yeah.
perspective, I think.
That immediacy is one of the key things in understanding how the child is seeing this whole experience.
Yeah.
It's happening right now.
Yeah.
It's all very, very direct.
Okay, so where does our intrepid little climber start their journey?
Well, right at the base camp.
Yeah.
It's the old brogues, dusty and cracked.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the first things that the child encounters, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of tell us something about the grandfather already.
Yeah.
That he's maybe been on lots of walks, that he's lived a really full life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just that word old, I think immediately gives us a sense of this kind of, like a well-worn pair of shoes.
Yeah, well loved.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then we get this easy scramble onto his trousers.
Right.
I mean, that easy scramble almost sounds a bit too easy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's kind of part of the humor of the poem as well.
Yeah.
It's that contrast between what is probably quite a big adventure for the child and how they're describing it in this very kind of simple
Yeah.
and almost understated way.
Yeah. And then we get, pushing into the weave, trying to get a grip. I mean, you can really feel the tactile nature.
You really can, yeah.
Those little hands.
Exploring the fabric of the trousers.
Yeah. And then it moves up to the overhanging shirt.
Yes.
And there's a change of direction going along the belt.
Right.
And it really is like navigating different parts of this, landscape.
It is, yeah. And it's kind of like a map. You can almost
Yes.
see the child moving across the grandfather's body.
Yeah. And then we get to the hand, and this is a really, kind of striking description.
It is, yeah.
So you've got earth stained, we've got nails are splintered and give good purchase. And then we get this amazing line, skin of his finger is smooth and thick like warm ice.
Right. What do you make of that warm ice?
I think it's such a surprising combination of words.
Yeah.
And, I think it really gets us to think about how these two ideas can actually coexist.
Yeah.
So you've got warm, which suggests comfort and love. And then you've got ice, which, suggests something that's cold and maybe a little bit distant. And I think it really captures something about the grandfather that's both strong and comforting at the same time.
Yeah.
Maybe he seems a bit rough and tough on the outside,
Yeah.
but underneath there's a real kind of, gentleness and a care.
Yeah. And I think that ice is really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Because for me, it also suggests like a coolness or a distance.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something about the generation gap.
Right.
Like there is a distance there.
Yeah.
But the child is trying to overcome that.
Yeah. I think that's a great way of putting it, that kind of push and pull.
Yeah. And then the climb continues and they find the glassy ridge of a scar and are really careful.
Placing their feet in the old stitches.
It's almost like the child is becoming aware of the grandfather's history.
Yeah.
They're noticing the stories that are etched onto his body.
Yeah.
And they're being really kind of gentle and careful around them.
Yeah. And then we get to the shoulder.
Yeah.
And there's a moment of rest in the shade, not looking down.
Yeah.
Why is that not looking down important?
I think it's really interesting. I think it could be about trust again.
Yeah.
That the child feels safe and supported.
Yeah.
But it also kind of reminds me of that feeling when you're climbing high up and you don't want to look down.
Yeah.
You just focus on what's ahead.
Yeah.
And maybe it's about that focus of getting to know the grandfather without being kind of overwhelmed by how different he might seem.
Yeah, that's a really good.
It's about kind of facing the challenge head on.
Yeah, and then the climb gets even more kind of personal and intimate, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Up the loose skin of his neck to a smiling mouth to drink among teeth.
I mean, that image, I think, is just so brilliant.
Yeah.
It's so vivid, you can really imagine, the closeness and the intimacy of that moment.
Yeah, and then they cross the screed cheek to the
Yes.
eyes and look into his brown eyes and watch a pupil slowly open and close.
And that feels like a really key moment of connection, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like they're looking into each other and really trying to see what's going on.
Yeah, it's a very sort of intense.
Yeah, it is. It's that focused attention.
Yeah.
Like the child is really trying to kind of understand what's going on inside the grandfather's head.
Yeah, and then finally we get to the summit, the thick hair, soft and white at this altitude.
Yes, and that image, of the hair being white at the top.
Yeah.
Really kind of brings that mountain imagery full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the snow on the peak.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's it like when they reach the top?
Well, I think there's this sense of achievement, but also exhaustion, gasping for breath.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then there's this beautiful, peaceful image watching clouds and birds circle.
Yeah.
It's that moment of calm and seeing things from a new perspective.
Yeah. And what about that final image, feeling his heat, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart?
I mean, that is just such a simple but powerful way of showing that connection, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the physical closeness, but also this kind of, reassurance of the grandfather's life and his presence.
Yeah, and I think it brings the whole adventure to this really kind of heartwarming conclusion.
It does, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the structure of the poem.
Right.
So one of the first things that you notice is that it's one long stanza.
It is.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's really important because it emphasizes that continuous feeling of the climb.
Yeah.
It's one action flowing into the next.
Yeah.
And I think it also reflects how a child might think. Their thoughts kind of tumble out one after the other.
Yeah, and we've also got lots of enjambment in the poem.
Yeah, we do.
Can you give us an example of where we see that and what effect it has?
Yeah, so one of the really clear examples is by the overhanging shirt, I change direction to reverse along his belt.
Yeah.
So you've got change at the end of one line and then direction at the start of the next.
Yeah.
And that kind of, encourages you to keep reading.
Yeah.
Kind of mirrors that change in movement.
Yeah.
And I think, generally speaking, enjambment just makes the poem feel like it's flowing really naturally.
Yeah.
Like one continuous movement or thought.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that central metaphor, the climbing.
Okay.
Why do you think it works so well in this poem?
Well, I think it's a really clever idea because it has so many different layers.
Yeah.
So on one level, it's showing the effort that's involved in getting to know someone, especially someone from a different generation.
Yeah.
But it also kind of makes the grandfather seem really strong and solid, like a mountain that the child can rely on.
Yeah.
And then there's this idea of risk or peril that some people talk about.
Yeah.
And that could suggest the challenges of actually understanding another person.
Yeah.
It's not always easy.
Yeah.
And I think also, thinking about Andrew Waterhouse's love for nature, it kind of fits in with this idea of the grandfather being almost like a part of the natural world.
Yeah.
He's something that's grand and enduring.
Yeah. And what about those little details, like those word combinations that we've talked about? Warm ice.
Yeah.
Easy scramble. What do they add to the poem?
I think they're really important because they make us stop and think.
Yeah.
So, warm ice isn't something that you'd normally put together.
Yeah.
So it forces you to kind of consider the different sides of the grandfather's character.
Yeah.
And easy scramble.
Yeah.
Maybe that's how the child sees something that's actually quite a challenge.
Yeah.
It's their perspective on things.
Yeah.
I think they just add this kind of, richness and depth to the poem.
Okay, so if we think about the themes of the poem,
Hmm.
what are the big ideas that we see?
Well, I think definitely childhood
Yeah.
and how children experience and make sense of the world.
Yeah.
They do it through play
Yeah.
and physical activity.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real celebration of that in the poem.
Yeah. And then you've got the relationship between a grandparent and grandchild,
Yeah,
which is obviously central to the poem.
absolutely. And that kind of growing trust and understanding.
Yeah.
And I think underneath it all, it's a poem about family love,
Yeah.
and those bonds that tie us together.
Yeah. We know that Andrew Waterhouse was really interested in the environment.
Yes.
So how does that interest maybe come across in this poem?
I think knowing that he loved nature helps us to see why this climbing image is so strong.
Yeah.
It makes you think of the grandfather as being this kind of really important figure,
Yeah.
almost like a landmark in the child's life.
Yeah.
And even the descriptions, of his skin and his hair have this kind of very natural, earthy feel to them.
Yeah, and just very briefly, are there any other poems that you think this connects to?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to compare it with Seamus Heaney's Follower,
Right.
because both of those poems use this central image
Yeah.
of an activity sailing in Follower and climbing here
Yeah.
to explore a relationship with an older family member.
Yeah.
And that kind of feeling of looking up to them.
Yeah.
But the way that they're written is really different.
Yeah.
Climbing My Grandfather is one solid block,
Yeah.
whereas Follower has these regular stanzas.
Yeah.
You could also connect it with Simon Armitage's Mother Any Distance,
Yeah.
because both of them use a physical action measuring in that case
Yeah.
as a way of exploring the relationship.
Yeah.
And both of them have this really personal,
Yeah.
present tense kind of feel to them.
Yeah. So as we come to the end of our climbing my grandfather. Right.
What would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the main thing to remember is how the poem uses this really simple idea of a child climbing
Yeah.
to show us the effort
Yeah.
and the love that's involved in getting to know someone,
Yeah.
especially across different generations.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how even everyday actions can be a way of building those really strong connections and understanding each other better.
That's such a lovely way to put it, I think.
Yeah, wow.
And I think that's a really nice thought to end on.
Right.
Thinking about somebody in your own family, maybe
Yeah.
a grandparent or another relative that you're close to,
Yeah.
and thinking about what it would be like to climb them.
Yeah.
What details would you notice along the way?
Yeah.
What kind of journey would you be on, and what would you understand
Yeah.
when you got to the top?
I think that's a really nice image to take away.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time. See you then.